The billionaire CEO had a $50 million wedding with a poor waitress. But what his bride did after 72 hours shocked the world. Silas Vance was a man who owned the world, but as he sat on the edge of a cold, king-sized bed, he had never felt more like a pauper. Just 72 hours ago, he had stood before 50 million people, watching, from the internet, and promised forever to the only woman who ever truly saw him. Now, the wedding of the century had transformed into a nightmare that no amount of billions could fix. His breath hitched in the hollow silence of a mansion that suddenly felt like a tomb. There were no signs of a struggle and no ransom demands from the rivals he had spent his life defeating. Instead, there was a devastating, surgical quiet. On the cold marble vanity sat his bride's $500,000 wedding ring, abandoned like a piece of worthless glass. Next to it lay a manila envelope, its weight heavier than his entire corporate empire. Silas had spent his career predicting every move in the global market, yet he was completely blindsided by the woman he loved. As he stared at the empty space where his future used to be, he realized the ultimate brutal truth. He had tried to buy a fairy tale, but he was about to learn that the most expensive things in this world are the ones you can't pay for with a wire transfer. To understand how a titan of industry ended up broken and alone in a silent mansion, we have to go back to a rainy night on Route 11 in Virginia, the night the world stood still and a secret began to tick. Before we continue the story, comment below which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The rain on Route 11 didn't fall, it attacked. It turned the Virginia pines into jagged silhouettes and the asphalt into a black mirror that reflected nothing but the void. At 1 this stretch of highway is a graveyard for the weary. It's the hour when the only people on the road are those running from something, or those with nowhere left to go. Silas Vance was neither. At least, that's what he told himself as he gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel of his $300,000 Italian supercar. Silas was 36, the CEO of Vance Global Logistics, and a man who lived his life by the clock. He measured success in quarters and efficiency. To Silas, a mountain wasn't a landmark, it was an obstacle in a supply chain. A storm wasn't an act of God, it was a delay in shipping. But the universe has a way of humbling men who think they've mastered it. When the alternator in his hand-built engine decided to surrender, the high-tech dashboard flickered once, gasped, and went dark. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the death of a high-performance engine in the middle of a forest. It's heavy. It's mocking. Silas sat in the dark for a moment, the scent of expensive leather and hot coolant filling the cabin. He reached for his phone, 0 bars. He was a man who could move 10,000 containers across the Pacific with a single email. Yet here he was, defeated by a dead battery and a lack of cell towers. He stepped out into the deluge, his $2,000 tailored wool coat soaking through in seconds. He began to walk. Every step in the mud felt like an insult to his status. He thought about the board meeting he was supposed to attend in D.C. He thought about his private jet waiting on a tarmac 3 hours away. But as the wind howled through the pines, Silas realized that out here his title meant nothing. He was just a man walking through the rain, looking for a light in the dark. That light eventually appeared in the form of a flickering neon sign, the Blue Ridge Diner. The B in blue flickered with a rhythmic buzz, a dying heartbeat in the Virginia mist. When Silas pushed open the heavy glass door, a bell chimed, a thin, lonely sound that cut through the hum of the fluorescent lights. The diner was a relic of a different era. The floors were checkered linoleum worn white in the high-traffic areas, and the air smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax. Behind the counter stood Clara Sterling. She didn't look like a character from Silas's world. She was 29, wearing faded blue scrubs under a stained apron, her hair tied back in a messy bun that suggested she had been awake for 20 hours. Silas stood by the door, dripping water onto the floor, expecting an immediate reaction. He was used to people jumping to attention when he entered a room. He waited for the "Sir, can I help you?" or the look of awe that usually followed his arrival. Instead, Clara didn't even look up from the counter she was scrubbing. Coffee's fresh, Booths are open and the heater's acting up, so pick one close to the kitchen if you want to stay warm, she said, her voice steady and unimpressed. Silas blinked. My car broke down. An Italian Grand Tourer. I need a phone and a high-end towing service. Clara finally looked up. Her eyes weren't filled with the frantic energy of the city. They were calm, deep, and tired. Well, unless your Italian car can fly, you're stuck until 6 a.m. when Joe opens the station down the road. And my phone is a landline that only works when the wind isn't blowing sideways. Sit down, Mr. Suit. You look like you're about to catch your death. Silas found himself sliding onto a vinyl stool that had seen better decades. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't in control. Clara slid a thick, white ceramic mug of coffee toward him. It wasn't the artisanal espresso he was used to. It was strong, bitter, and hot. It felt like the most honest thing he'd tasted in years. As the storm rattled the windows, the silence between them shifted from awkward to comfortable. Silas looked at Clara. He noticed the way she moved, with a weary grace. He saw the trauma nurse in her, the woman who spent her days in the literal trenches of human suffering, only to spend her nights here to pay off the debts the hospital wouldn't forgive for her mother. You're a nurse, Silas remarked, gesturing to her scrubs. I was, she said, pouring herself a cup. I mean, I am. Shift ended at 8. I help out here 3 nights a week. My mom, she's had a rough year with the specialists. The American dream doesn't come cheap when your heart starts failing you. For some reason, Silas didn't offer to write a check. He didn't try to solve her with his wealth. Instead, he told her about his father. He talked about a man who had worked at the coal mines in West Virginia, a man who had died, with nothing but a pair of blackened lungs and a reputation for never lying to a neighbor. He told her how he had spent his life trying to run away from that poverty, only to realize he had run so far he couldn't remember what he was running toward. Clara listened. She didn't interrupt with platitudes or fake sympathy. She just leaned against the back counter, watching him with an intensity that made Silas feel like she was reading the fine print of his soul. In that moment, the billionaire and the nurse weren't separated by millions of dollars. They were just 2 people sharing a slice of apple pie while the world outside fell apart. As she reached over to refill his mug, her fingers brushed against his. It was a brief accidental contact, but it felt like a spark in a dark room. It wasn't the practiced intimacy of the socialites Silas usually dated. It was raw. It was real. It was the realization that in the middle of a Virginia storm, 2 people from opposite ends of the world had found a common language. Silas Vance thought he was the one who needed a tow truck that night. He had no idea that he had just stumbled into a woman who would force him to dismantle everything he thought he knew about power, love, and the price of a soul. As the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the rain, Silas looked at Clara and realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to go back to the world where everyone knew his name, but nobody knew his heart. But as he watched her walk back to the kitchen, Silas didn't see the manila envelope in her bag. He didn't see the secret she was carrying, a secret that was already counting down the hours until she would have to break his heart to save his life. The 3 months that followed that night in the Blue Ridge Diner were what Silas would later call his summer of shadows. It was a period of life that felt less like a reality and more like a fever dream, a bridge between the cold, calculated man he had been and the person he was desperately trying to become. For Silas Vance, a man whose time was valued at thousands of dollars per minute, the logistics of their romance were nonsensical. Every Friday afternoon, he would leave the glass towers of D.C. behind, trading his leather office chair for the driver's seat of a more rugged American truck, a subtle change he made after that first night. He would drive 4 hours south, winding through the Shenandoah Valley, just to reach the diner by 8 p.m. He wasn't there for a gala or a board meeting. He was there to sit in a booth and wait for Clara to finish her shift at the hospital so he could walk her to her car. To his colleagues, he was becoming erratic. To the world, he was becoming a ghost. But to Silas, those 4-hour drives were the only time he felt truly awake. He began to learn the rhythm of Clara's world. He learned that she didn't just work for the paycheck. She worked because she couldn't stand the thought of a patient being alone in their final moments. He saw the bruises on her feet from 12-hour shifts and the way she would still smile at a regular at the diner, even when her eyes were clouded with exhaustion. One humid July evening, as the crickets in the Virginia pines created a wall of sound that felt almost physical, Silas decided he had seen enough of her struggling. They were sitting on the tailgate of his truck, the smell of honeysuckle heavy in the air. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. "Clara," he began, his voice low. "I've seen the bills, your mother's house, the hospital debts. It's a drop in the bucket for me. Let me settle it. Let me give you your life back." Clara didn't look at the checkbook. She didn't even look at him. She stared out at the dark tree line, her expression unreadable. For a long minute, the only sound was the distant hum of the highway. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't angry, it was disappointed. "Silas," she said softly, "you think my life is something I lost because I'm poor. You think dignity is something you can buy for me with a signature." She turned to him then, her eyes sharp in the moonlight. "I love you, because when we're in that diner, you're just Silas. But the moment you reach for that checkbook, you're trying to become my owner, not my partner. My integrity isn't a debt to be cleared. It's who I am." That was the first moral lesson Silas learned. Some things are only valuable because they are hard-earned. He put the checkbook away, feeling ashamed that no amount of success had ever prepared him for. He realized then that Clara Sterling wasn't a woman he could save. She was a woman he had to be worthy of. But while their emotional bond was growing stronger, a silent shadow was beginning to stretch over them. Clara had started feeling a persistent, dull ache in her chest, a rhythmic fluttering that felt like a bird trapped in a cage. As a trauma nurse, she didn't need a doctor to tell her that something was wrong. She knew the signs. In secret, while Silas was back in DC managing global trade routes, Clara traveled to a specialist in Minnesota. She sat in a sterile white room, listening to a doctor explain that she had a rare congenital heart defect. It was operable, but the surgery was a 50-50 gamble, a high-stakes procedure that offered no guarantees. She stood at a crossroads that day. She could tell Silas and watch the light she had just helped him find vanish from his eyes. She could watch him turn back into the logistics CEO, trying to manage her health like a corporate merger. Or she could give him one perfect summer. She chose the latter. She decided that if her time was limited, she wanted Silas to know what it felt like to be happy without a price tag attached. By August, the heat in Virginia was stifling, but Silas felt a clarity he had never known. He took Clara back to the Blue Ridge Diner, to the very same vinyl stool where they had shared that first slice of apple pie. The neon sign still flickered, and the fluorescent lights still hummed their tired song. He didn't have a grand speech. He simply took her hand, his heart hammering against his ribs, harder than any business deal ever made it pulse. "Clara," he whispered, "I've spent my whole life building walls and calling them an empire, but you're the only person who ever showed me what was actually inside them. I don't want to protect my assets anymore. I want to protect you. Forever." He pulled out the ring, the diamond that would later shock the world. Clara looked at it, and for the first time she cried. Silas thought they were tears of overwhelmed joy. He didn't see the sadness behind her eyes, the look of a woman who knew she was saying yes to a future she might not live to see. She accepted his proposal, but as they sat in that quiet diner, the summer of shadows was reaching its peak. The wedding was being planned, the world was starting to take notice, and Clara's heart was beginning to count down the 72 hours that would eventually change everything. By the time the humid Virginia summer began to bleed into a crisp, golden autumn, the quiet world Silas and Clara had built inside the Blue Ridge Diner was no longer their own. The news of the billionaire and the nurse had leaked, spreading through the digital ether like a wildfire in a canyon. To the public, it was the ultimate underdog story, the titan of industry who had been humbled by a woman who spent her days saving lives in a trauma ward. Silas, ever the man of action, decided that if the world was going to watch his transformation, he would give them a masterpiece to remember. The logistics of the wedding were a marvel of modern engineering, a testament to the vast cold power of Silas's wealth. He chose a historic estate in the Carolinas, a place where the massive, moss-draped oaks stood like silent sentinels over the marshlands. He didn't just hire a florist, he commissioned an ecosystem. 10,000 white roses were harvested in the high altitudes of the Andes, transported in climate-controlled jets, and pinned to every available surface of the estate until the very air smelled like a mountain of perfume. A private orchestra was flown in from Europe, their instruments tuned to the humidity of the coast, tasked with playing a soundtrack that felt as though it were being broadcast from another world. But this was more than a celebration. It was the ultimate social media trap. Silas had arranged for a global livestream, turning their private I-Do into a digital event that commanded the attention of 50 million viewers across the planet. From the subways of Tokyo to the high-rises of Manhattan, people stared at their screens, typing goals into comment sections that moved too fast to read. The world saw a fairy tale, but as Clara stood in the bridal suite, she saw a countdown. The $500,000 wedding dress was a marvel of hand-stitched lace and silk, but to Clara, it felt like a beautiful cage. The weight of the train was so heavy it required 2 assistants to move, and the bodice was pulled so tight she could feel the irregular thud of her own heart against the fabric. Every time her heart skipped a beat, that persistent, fluttering reminder of the defect she was hiding, she would catch her breath and force a smile for the cameras. The scent of the lilies, which Silas had chosen for their purity, began to smell like a funeral to her. She was a nurse, she knew the smell of transition. And as she looked at her reflection, she realized she wasn't just a bride, she was a woman preparing for a battle she might not survive. As she walked down the aisle, the 10,000 roses blurring into a white haze, she saw Silas standing at the altar. He looked at her with a raw, unprotected adoration that made her soul ache. He wasn't the CEO of Vance Global Logistics in that moment. He was just the man from the diner, the man who had shared his pie and his grief with a stranger in the rain. The vows were whispered into microphones that broadcast their intimacy to every corner of the globe. Silas took her hands, his voice cracking as he promised to build a world where she never had to work a double shift. Again, a world where the only thing she would ever have to worry about was which sunset they would watch together. When it was Clara's turn, she looked deep into his eyes, ignoring the 50 million digital witnesses. Her voice was a steady anchor in the sea of spectacle. She promised to love him as long as her heart allowed. To the viewers online, it was the most romantic line of the year, a poetic testament to the power of love. But to Clara, it was a literal pact with time. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the private orchestra reached a crescendo that echoed. Off the historic walls of the estate, the world celebrated the birth of a new dynasty. They saw the billionaire and the nurse as the pinnacle of human success. They didn't see the manila envelope tucked away in Clara's belongings. Nor did they understand that the $50 million spectacle was merely the opening act for a shock that would leave the world and Silas Vance reeling in just 72 hours. The transition from the deafening roar of the $50 million spectacle to the profound silence of Silas. His private coastal estate was jarring, a sudden plunge into deep, still water after a lifetime of storms. The global livestream had finally gone dark. The 50 million viewers had retreated into the anonymity of their own lives, and back at the estate, the 10,000 white roses were already beginning to brown at the edges, their fragrance turning from sweet to somber. For the first time since that rainy night in Virginia, Silas and Clara were truly alone, surrounded by nothing but the rhythmic, salt-heavy thud of the Atlantic Ocean against the dunes. The first 24 hours were a blur of blissful, almost desperate isolation. They spent the first morning of their marriage swimming in the ocean at dawn, the water cold and bracing against their skin as the sun bled a bruised orange across the horizon. Silas felt a peace he hadn't known since his childhood, a sense that the beautiful cage of his billion-dollar empire had finally been unlocked by the woman beside him. He watched Clara as she walked along the shoreline, her footprints disappearing into the wet sand entirely, unaware that every step she took was a calculated move in a much larger, more desperate strategy. As the 48-hour mark approached, the atmosphere inside the house began to shift, though Silas was too blinded by the light of his own happiness to see the shadows moving in the corners of the room. While Silas slept in the afternoon, exhausted by the emotional weight of the wedding, Clara moved through the suite with the quiet, practiced precision of a surgical nurse. She pulled a small, battered duffel bag from beneath the heavy mahogany bed, the same bag she had carried. During her hardest double shifts at the hospital, long before she met a man with a private jet, she didn't pack the designer silk gowns or the custom-made jewelry Silas had gifted her. Instead, she folded her faded nursing scrubs, tucked away her old stethoscope, and placed a thick, heavy manila envelope at the very top. She spent that entire evening sitting by the window in the dark, staring at Silas while he slept, memorizing the specific rhythm of his breathing, as if she were trying to store enough of his presence in her own soul to last through the winter of what was coming. By the 72nd hour, the countdown reached its inevitable silent zero. The moment arrived when Silas was pulled into his home office by an emergency call from his board of directors, a stark reminder that even on his honeymoon, the global machinery he had built demanded its tribute. It was the perfect, heartbreaking window Clara had been waiting for. She walked to the marble vanity, her hand trembling as she slid the $500,000 wedding ring off her finger. She placed it directly on top of the manila envelope, the diamond catching a stray beam of sunlight that made it look like a cold, hard tear resting on the paper. She didn't call a limousine. She didn't alert the pilot of the private jet that sat fueled and ready on a nearby tarmac. Instead, Clara Sterling, now Clara Vance, walked out the back door through the shifting dunes and began the long walk toward the local train station. There was no private transport, no fanfare, and no looking back. Dressed in simple jeans and a dark hoodie, she disappeared into the vast American landscape, blending in with the millions of other souls moving through the world unnoticed. When Silas finally hung up the phone and walked back into the master suite, calling her name, he found only a silence that tasted of salt and abandonment. The bride who had captivated 50 million people just 3 days prior had vanished, leaving him alone in a mansion that suddenly felt like a tomb. The mystery of the shock had begun, and the road back to Clara would be the hardest logistics problem Silas would ever have to solve. For Silas Vance, the 48 hours following Clara's disappearance were a descent into a specific kind of hell that no amount of wealth could mitigate. He had spent his entire life mastering the world of physical objects, ships, planes, and trucks, moving across a map, but he was utterly powerless against the vacuum left by a woman's absence. He didn't just call the police. He activated a global network of private investigators, digital forensics experts, and former intelligence officers. He expected a kidnapping. He expected a ransom demand from a rival corporation. Deep in the darkest, most cynical corner of his mind, he even expected that. Clara had been a world-class con artist who had finally cashed in her chips. But as the reports started trickling back to the coastal estate, the truth was far stranger and more humbling than any conspiracy theory. There were no offshore bank transfers, no secret lovers. Instead, his team found a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a public university hospital in the frozen landscape of Minnesota. When Silas's private jet touched down in the middle of a snowstorm, he didn't wait for a limousine. He took a battered taxi to the hospital, his $5,000 overcoat standing out like a beacon in the drab, sterile hallways of public healthcare. He found her in a waiting room, sitting in a plastic chair under a flickering, fluorescent light that reminded him of the Blue Ridge Diner. She looked smaller than he remembered, dressed in a simple hoodie, clutching a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. When she looked up and saw him, she didn't run. She didn't apologize. She simply gestured to the seat beside her. "I didn't want you to see me like this, Silas," she whispered, her voice rasping. "I wanted you to have the 72 hours. I wanted you to have a memory of a wife who was whole, not a patient who was broken." It was then that the manila envelope Silas had found on the vanity began to make sense. As they sat in that crowded waiting room, Clara explained the shock that would soon dominate every news cycle on the planet. It wasn't about theft, it was about a masterclass in American legal and medical strategy. First, there was the property angle. Clara's mother's home had been caught in a predatory life estate battle. with a lender that specialized in draining the equity of the elderly. By marrying Silas, a man of his massive legal and financial standing, Clara's legal team, funded by her own secret savings, had been able to file an emergency injunction. The marriage instantly transformed the house into a marital asset of a high net worth individual. The predatory lenders, who had spent years bullying a lonely nurse and her sick mother, were suddenly facing the most expensive law firms in the country. The house was safe before the wedding cake had even been cut. But the second revelation was the one that brought Silas to tears. Clara needed the surgery for her heart defect, a procedure with a 50-50 chance of success. But more than the surgery itself, she needed a legal next of kin who possessed the power to ensure her medical legacy survived if she didn't. She had manipulated the $50 million wedding to create a social media trap. By making their union the most visible event in the world, she ensured that the legacy grant she had tucked into their prenuptial agreement, a clause Silas had signed as a routine charity item, would be impossible for his board of directors to contest if she passed away. She hadn't married him for his money, she had married him for his status to protect her mother, and to fund a foundation for nurses facing the same medical debts she had fought alone. She left him because she didn't want him to be a widower CEO trapped in a cycle of grief. She wanted him to be a man who had experienced 72 hours of a perfect dream before the harsh reality of the operating room took over. As the doctors called her name for the pre-op sequence, Silas realized the ultimate truth. He had been the one who was poor. He had all the money in the world, but Clara Sterling had the kind of wealth that was measured in sacrifice, integrity, and the courage to break her own heart to protect the people she loved. The surgery lasted 9 hours. 9 hours where Silas Vance, a man who once controlled the flow of global commerce, sat in a plastic chair and realized that his billions were as useless as pocket change against the mystery of a beating heart. He watched the digital clock on the hospital wall, each second ticking by like a hammer against an anvil. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a watch to see if a shipment was on time. He was looking at a clock to see if his life still had a meaning. When the lead surgeon finally stepped through the double doors, his face lined with the deep exhaustion of a man who had spent the day fighting for another soul, he gave Silas a simple, weary nod. The surgery was a success. Clara Sterling, the nurse who had outsmarted a billionaire to save her mother's legacy, was going to live. The shock that hit the world in the following weeks wasn't just about the mystery of the disappearance, it was about the transformation of the man who remained. The public expected a scandal. They expected Silas Vance to file for an annulment, to sue for fraud, or to retreat into his glass tower and hide from the humiliation of being used. Instead, Silas did something that defied every law of corporate logic. He didn't file for divorce, he filed for a resignation. He stood before his board of directors, not in a $3,000 suit, but in the same simple wool coat he had worn into the Blue Ridge Diner. He told them that he had spent his life building a world where people were treated like logistics, but he had found a woman who treated people like souls. He stepped down as CEO of Vance Global Logistics, handing over the keys to his empire to focus on the legacy grant Clara had established. 6 months later, the dust from the $50 million wedding had finally settled, buried under the quiet reality of a life lived with purpose. On a crisp Virginia evening, a reliable American truck pulled into the gravel lot of the Blue Ridge Diner. The Italian supercar was long gone, sold to fund a new wing of the University Hospital in Minnesota. Silas and Clara sat at the same vinyl stool where it had all begun. The neon sign still flickered, and the air still smelled of burnt coffee and rain-slicked pines. Clara looked healthier than she ever had, the color back in her cheeks, and the weight of the secret finally lifted from her shoulders. Silas took her hand, not to check for a ring, but simply to feel the pulse of a heart that he now understood was the only true wealth he would ever own. As the bell above the door chimed for a new traveler entering from the rain, Silas realized that 1 million views couldn't save a life, and $50 million couldn't buy a home. But a nurse's quiet plan and a man's willingness to forgive had built a legacy that would outlast every tower he had ever constructed. Wealth, he finally understood, is not what you have in your vault. It is the person who is willing to break their own heart to protect yours. And as the Virginia moon rose over the pines, Silas Vance was finally, truly, the richest man in the world. What do you think? Do you think Clara used Silas? Share your opinion in the comments and rate the story from 0 to 10. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories, and don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen.